Hi, students. Welcome to Unit 3. This unit is on industrialization and nationalism, and it basically takes place over the course of the 19th century. But in particular, we're going to focus on the years between 1800 and 1870. And this is going to be in Chapter 19 in your textbook. So the first section is about the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, and the focus question you're going to have to answer for this section is why did the Industrial Revolution occur and what impact did it make? So there's going to be a lot of different ways you're going to be able to answer that question because there's a lot of reasons that the Industrial Revolution occurred, and there are many different kinds of impacts that it made. So you can kind of focus on what you're the most interested in. So this is a painting. Probably if you search Industrial Revolution paintings, not that I did that and that's what popped up, but it's both in your textbook and it was the first thing that popped up on Google. You'll find this one. And so this is called Coalbrookdale by Night. You can see in the background, you've got the coke creating process, which is basically when you take coal and you turn it into kind of like a coal charcoal. It's used for steel and iron production. You can see that even though it's nighttime, the city sky is lit up almost like a sunset, and the various industrial worker housing kind of buildings throughout the foreground here. And then in the very far right hand corner, you've got kind of a natural image with the moon and a wooded hillside as a contrast. So the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain and largely as a result of a revolution in agriculture. So this actually, instead of saying 1870, it should say 1780 is when the Industrial Revolution began. And it basically, what the Industrial Revolution is, as you should remember from last year, is basically a shift from an economy that is based on agriculture and the production of goods by hand, what's called artisan goods, to one based on manufacture of goods by machines and factories, and the economy being based on the ownership of those factories. But before we could get to that point, there has to be kind of the ingredients that you need to have an industrial revolution. And the first thing is you need more people. You need a new crop that makes it easier to grow food and to have more children that are more resistant to disease. And that crop is the potato. So the Spanish Empire begins importing potatoes into Europe around 1500, and it's estimated roughly 30% of the population growth that occurs in Europe in the next 50 years comes from the introduction of this nutrient rich crop to countries like Great Britain. So in Great Britain, there's a unique situation where almost every small farmer who basically owns a small bit of land is suddenly able to produce a surplus crop and sell the food that their family doesn't need to eat for extra capital, which is a word that means movable money. And so famine ceases, which makes it so you have more security to invest that extra money you have into things that eventually will become the first factories in Europe. So this is a chart showing basically world population growth and these a population that basically lives in cities. You notice a sharp jump here around 1800 about the number of people who live in cities. That's the beginning of the first industrial revolution, and when factories start being built in cities and people move from the countryside into these urban areas. But you can see before that, this first line or the line above it is the world population. That begins to grow quickly before the move to the city. And so you can, roughly around 1492, you see a beginning of growth in world population with the potato being introduced to Europe. And that is kind of a leading indicator that the Industrial Revolution is going to happen because there's enough people available to go move to those cities as well. So this map on the right is probably going to be the first thing that draws your attention, and it's colored a whole bunch of different colors. The thing you need to know is just like you might expect, blue means water. And so what this map is showing you is there's no spot in Great Britain that is more than 70 miles from the sea, and there's very few spots that are more than a few miles from a river that could bring you to the ocean. Which, remembering the importance of sea power and history from the US2 class, empires with access to water have access to markets, which makes it so they end up having more access to money and ultimately power. Those that basically that are in the nobility, if you remember from the last unit, they have been stripped of their political power. So there's a bunch of rich people with a lot of land growing potatoes and making a bunch of money with nothing to do. And these idle rich people invest their money into new inventions that, kind of willing to take a risk because they have nothing to lose. and they start becoming entrepreneurs or new business owners and new factory owners. Very conveniently for the geography of Great Britain, right in the midst of all of these rivers, there are mountains chock full of coal and iron, which are two of the materials that become important in the Industrial Revolution. And you remember from, basically anytime we've talked about Great Britain, there's a gigantic British Navy that allows these goods that are produced to be exported safely to both their colonies and to foreign countries without interception by pirates like the Spanish Empire used to suffer with. So the first industry that is industrialized is the weaving industry. And so there's an image I have up here of weavers in ancient Egypt kind of showing the spinning and weaving process. So you can see, it's clearly pretty labor intensive. The gentleman on the bottom is literally straddled over the loom and is pulling the cloth over. The two women on top, there's one woman weaving, another woman spinning the fiber into thread. So really labor intensive job. It takes a lot of skill to weave. It's again very physically taxing and it's very time consuming. And so whole households are supported by women in these cottage industries, which is a phrase for a home-based industry where goods are made by hand. The invention that's right above my head in this video that I'm doing is called the flying shuttle. And this invention makes it so you need half as many weavers to produce the same amount of cloth. It's invented in 1733, and it's the first time since basically the days of ancient Egypt that the weaving process is changed. And so if you need half as many workers to produce the same number of cloth, those workers are now unemployed and you need to find something for them to do. And so, luckily or unluckily, depending on how you want to view the history of it, there's a large supply of cotton grown in the Americas that is able to be purchased for cheap because it's grown by enslaved people. And so mill villages pop up with all these unemployed workers who are now working with flying shuttles. And so they're doing this much faster process using American grown cotton. And so villages are built strictly for factories all around the country. Once James Watt invents the steam engine in 1782, roughly 50 years later, all of a sudden you have a increase in the speed still of the cotton production. And so basically you go from importing 2 million pounds of cotton from America in 1780, around the time of the American Revolution, and with the steam engine and the flying shuttle, you end up with 366 million pounds of cotton imported from the US to Great Britain by 1860. So this is an image of the first steam engine. And so you can see there's a wheel. And basically, the long story short with the steam engine, instead of moving objects by hand, you would have, or moving your flying shuttle by hand, a coal is going to be burned, it's going to boil water, and it's going to cause this wheel to take that energy and turn it into motion. So again, just to really simplify, the Industrial Revolution is about machines taking energy stored in fossil fuels, coal, and turning it into motion so people don't have to do it. And so, or no longer can do it because it's cheaper to have a machine. So this is really a fundamental piece of all of this. So the coal and iron industries are kind of the second two industries that form or really grow out of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So cotton's the first. It's benefits from cheap coal coming out of these coal mines that are in high supply in Great Britain, and the coal is easy to transport. And basically, there's a process discovered by a gentleman named Henry Cort called puddling, in which it becomes possible to take a byproduct of coal called coke, which is basically burnt coal, and use it to make iron that is both cheaper and better than the iron that had been produced using a pre-industrial process. And so just kind of like cotton, Britain is exporting in 1740, 1,700 tons of cotton. If you think back to the American Revolution, that's part of what the revolution was about, is the British bringing their manufactured goods to the United States, to 3 million tons of iron being exported from Great Britain about 100 years later in 1852. So here's a GIF of how a steam engine works, and you can see it's attached to two wheels here because this is the section about the railroad. And so basically rail cars have been used since basically Roman times with wooden wheels and wooden rails in mines to take goods like coal out of the mines and into wherever they were going to be used. So once puddling has been invented, the coal mines have an even greater demand for coal. And so the cheap iron and steel is brought back to the coal mines. They build rails in these coal mines to bring even more coal out. That process accelerates. And then the steam engine's invented to be used in the cotton mills. And somebody has the genius idea of attaching the mine cart to a steam engine, which they can't use underground, obviously. And they start transporting in 1804 coal and iron ore from the mines in Wales to the cities where it's going to be turned into industrial goods. 1830 is the first public rail line that takes passengers, and it's a 32-mile line between Liverpool, England, which you may or may not know the Beatles are from, and Manchester, England, where they basically have the factories. The train's called the Rocket. It zooms along at 16 miles per hour, and it's considered extremely impressive at the time. But 20 years later, you have trains going 50 miles an hour, and you go from a 32 miles of rail to 2,000. And again, the same thing, even quicker with the railroads and some of these other processes. 10 years later, that triples to 6,000 miles of rail because it's a basically the cheapest transport possible, cheaper even than going by the rivers. There are lots of new jobs that are created. There's lots of new sales of goods because they're cheaper to transport. More sales means more factories. That means more machines. That means more jobs. And that means more profit for those that own those factories. So the railroads matter because they accelerate this whole process even further. So as far as the spread of the Industrial Revolution from Great Britain, by 1840 or so, historians say that Great Britain has industrialized. Most tasks that can be done by machine are now done by machine, and handmade goods are no longer produced as a majority of goods in Great Britain. By 1850, Great Britain is producing half of all the manufactured goods in the world. And so cottage industries in countries, especially neighboring Britain, go out of business and they're forced to industrialize. And so the governments of states like Belgium and France basically start funding people to build factories instead of growing potatoes, for example. In the US, millions of people emigrate to the United States because they've lost their farming jobs or their cottage industry jobs in the European countries that are industrializing, and they move to this country and largely to the cities where there are factories being built as well. Similarly to Great Britain, the rail industry is coupled directly with industrialization and population growth. And you go from 13 million people who are mostly farmers in the US to 30 million by 1860. And you go from 100 miles of track to 30,000 miles of track, largely to service factories in the northeast of the United States. And most people at this time period are moving from rural areas to urban areas. And a lot of times there's women who are emigrating with their children because those are the industries, again, those cottage industries are destroyed before most other ones in Europe. So the social impact of the Industrial Revolution is pretty widespread. In short, there's a social pyramid that already exists in Europe. There's an image right here with the nobility on top, the clergy down below, and then if you remember from the last unit, the third estate, so just the general population down the bottom level. Industrial capitalism, it basically says that the owners of the factories are in the top of this pyramid. You can see the money bag in the top of this image, and you get two classes: the bourgeoisie, who include basically the managers of the factories and those that benefit from capitalism, lawyers, teachers, clerks, bankers, things like that, and the proletariat, those that are working in the harsh conditions of the mines and the factories. And again, this includes many women and children who get worse rates than men do on a general basis. Just to read the sides of this, the top says capitalism. The next level says we rule you. The clergy here, it has the we fool you. And it's got soldiers, we shoot at you. And then the bourgeoisie right down here, the new class, we eat for you. And then the proletariat, who's suffering here in this cartoon, which says we feed all. All right, and this is the last bit of it. Socialism means something a little bit different in the early Industrial Revolution. And so we'll get to that distinction with later socialism. But basically, socialism rises in the early years of the Industrial Revolution because, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, life for workers was nasty, brutish, and short. The new capitalist entrepreneurs of the factories, they don't really set conditions. There's no one telling them how to set conditions, so they focus on profit over the people that they're working for. Some factory owners, though, tried to basically create a system in which cooperation would replace competition. And they believed that if they created factories like the one in this drawing, then basically the public would gain control of goods and services, and this would be a solution to these conditions. Karl Marx criticizes these folks for their kind of unrealistic hope in his ideas, in his view, rather, that people would voluntarily cooperate, and by calling them utopian socialists, which is actually where the first use of this socialist phrase. All right, so just go back to the beginning. You've got a focus question to answer, which is why did the Industrial Revolution occur and what impact did it make? Each of the questions on the top of the slides should hopefully help you build up to answer this bigger question. Good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.